He had been moving for 3 days without sleep, one measured push at a time, so close to the ground that grass stems left lines across his forearms he wouldn't notice until he was safe again. A twin .51 caliber machine gun position sat close enough that he could hear the crew talking. He did not stop. He did not speed up. Somewhere ahead, inside a compound he had spent 4 days crawling toward across open, watched ground, a North Vietnamese army general was about to step onto a porch and yawn in the morning air, with no idea that a single United States Marine had spent 4 days becoming part of the landscape specifically to make sure that yawn was the last thing he ever did. The Marine had one rule that mattered more than any other in that moment, a rule drilled into every man who carried a rifle like his: the first shot has to work. There is no second chance in this kind of war. To understand how that rule became a matter of survival, and why an entire generation of Marine snipers built their careers around never needing a follow-up shot, we have to go back to a rifle range in Hawaii in 1961, years before that general ever stepped onto his porch. In the years following the Korean War, the U.S. military had let sniper training quietly wither. Marksmanship competitions kept precision shooting alive as a sport, but the specific discipline of combat sniping, stalking, range estimation, wind reading, and the patience required to wait motionless for hours had no formal home in the Marine Corps until Major Edward James Land established the first organized sniper training program in 1961. Land, a competitive shooter himself, built a program in Hawaii that would eventually become the seed for the school's the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions ran directly in Vietnam once American ground forces arrived in strength in 1965. Those early Vietnam sniper schools armed their students with the Winchester Model 70, chambered in .30-06, topped with an 8-power Unertl scope, a rifle built originally for civilian and competition shooters rather than sustained combat use. It worked, and it worked well, with confirmed hits recorded out to 1,000 yards. But the rifle had a weakness that mattered more in the field than it ever had on a known distance range. Land later explained the problem in blunt terms. The newer commercial rifle actions available at the time used an extractor that could fail if the chamber wasn't cleaned after roughly every 10 rounds. In Vietnam, in triple canopy jungle, in monsoon humidity, on missions that might keep a 2-man sniper team motionless in a hide for days, that kind of maintenance schedule simply did not exist. Land pushed for something built specifically for the war. Marines were actually fighting, not the one marksmanship competitions had trained them for. The Marine Corps turned to Remington's custom shop in Ilion, New York, selecting the 700-40X target action as the foundation. The result, designated the M40, chambered the 7.62 NATO round, wore a heavier free-floated barrel than any sporting rifle of the era, and carried a Redfield AccuRange scope with variable 3-to-9 power magnification, a genuine upgrade over the fixed-power optics that had defined sniper rifles since the Second World War. Deliveries began reaching Marine snipers in Vietnam in 1966 and 1967. The rifle that would define Marine Corps sniping for the next 5 decades had arrived built around a single design philosophy. Whatever happened after the trigger broke, the rifle itself would not be the reason the shot failed. That still left the harder problem, the one no rifle design could solve. A sniper hide is only as good as its owner's discipline in refusing to compromise it, and nothing compromised a hide faster than a second shot. Every muzzle blast told anyone listening roughly where the round had come from. A miss, followed by another shot from the same position, was in practical terms a flare fired straight up announcing exactly where to search. Marine sniper doctrine that emerged from these early Vietnam deployments encoded that reality into an unwritten rule, passed from experienced snipers down to every new team entering the field. No more than a handful of shots from any single position before displacement became mandatory, and ideally, only the one shot that actually mattered. Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, deployed to Vietnam in 1966 and assigned to the 1st Marine Division's sniper platoon operating out, of Hill 55 south of Da Nang, built his entire reputation on exactly that principle. Hathcock wore a small white feather tucked into his bush hat, a deliberate, almost taunting signature that gave the North Vietnamese something to search for and never find. His personal rule, repeated to every Marine he trained afterward, held that a sniper firing from one position should take no more than a few shots before moving, and that the ideal engagement required exactly one. Not because more shots weren't tactically available, because every additional round fired from the same square yard of jungle floor multiplied the odds that the position and the man in it would be found before he could displace. The 4-day stalk toward the North Vietnamese general's compound, more than 1,500 yards of open, patrolled terrain covered inch by inch on his stomach, a technique Hathcock called worming, existed entirely in service of that single rule. He moved without food, without sleep that could be called rest, timing his advance so that patrols passing within arm's reach never noticed the change in the landscape beside them. When the general finally stepped onto the porch that morning, an aide walked briefly into the line of fire before clearing it again. Hathcock adjusted for the pause without adjusting for panic. The round covered roughly 700 yards and struck exactly where 4 days of patience had aimed it. Every soldier at the compound sprinted for the tree line the instant the shot rang out, because tree lines were where cover lived, and cover was the only thing that made sense to a unit that had just lost its commanding officer to a rifle they never heard fire twice. Hathcock was not the only Marine building a career on that same discipline. Gunnery Sergeant Chuck Mawhinney, who joined the Corps in 1967 and rotated home in 1969, accumulated 103 confirmed kills and 216 probable kills during his tour, operating under a personal rule almost as blunt as Hathcock's. If a man in his sights carried a weapon, the engagement was already decided before the trigger broke. Mawhinney's approach differed from Hathcock's in some particulars, but it rested on the identical foundation. A sniper's value came from the shots that never needed repeating, not from a high volume of fire that told an entire enemy company exactly where to converge. The spotter's job demanded a different, equally exacting kind of discipline. While the shooter held his breath and waited for the wind to settle, the spotter tracked range, corrected for mirage distortion rising off heated ground, and watched the surrounding terrain for any sign the position had been noticed. A team that functioned correctly operated almost silently, communicating in the smallest possible adjustments, because a whispered correction carried just as far in triple canopy silence as a shout would have on an open range. The spotter also carried the burden of memory, logging distances, wind conditions, and terrain features that would matter again on the next mission, building the kind of institutional knowledge that eventually became the backbone of Marine sniper doctrine itself. Vietnam's terrain punished any sniper who treated the job as a simple extension of range shooting back home. Elephant grass could conceal a low crawl for hundreds of yards, but it also swallowed sound and light in ways that made range estimation genuinely difficult without extensive practice. Monsoon humidity swelled wood stocks and crept into optics, and heat shimmer off rice paddies at midday could bend a sight line enough to turn a clean shot into a miss for anyone who hadn't trained specifically to read it. None of this appeared in a marksmanship manual written for a known distance range in the continental United States. It appeared only in the field, and Marine sniper schools in Vietnam rebuilt their curriculum around exactly these lessons as fast as returning snipers could report them. The tactical logic behind the one-shot standard extended well beyond simple concealment. A Marine sniper team in Vietnam typically consisted of 2 men, a shooter and a spotter, operating far outside the immediate support of a larger unit, sometimes for days at a stretch, deep in terrain that offered no quick reinforcement if a position was compromised. A missed shot didn't just risk the mission, it risked 2 men, alone, with no realistic option beyond immediate, opposed movement away from a location the enemy now knew with near total precision. Artillery support could sometimes be called in after the fact, walked onto suspected enemy positions once a team had displaced to safety, but that was damage control, not a substitute for the shot landing correctly the first time. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The discipline behind the legend, not just the legend itself. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. This is why Marine sniper training in Vietnam devoted so much of its curriculum to the elements that had nothing to do with pulling a trigger. Range estimation without a laser rangefinder, reading wind through grass movement and mirage shimmer, understanding how humidity and temperature shifted a bullet's drop. Over distances the Model 70 or M40 could reach, but rarely guaranteed on a single unadjusted shot. A sniper who could read all of that correctly earned the right to take exactly one shot with confidence. A sniper who couldn't was, by the doctrine's own logic, not ready to be in the position at all. Not every engagement resolved as cleanly as Hathcock's stalk against the general. Hathcock himself became the target of a prolonged counter-sniper hunt after a North Vietnamese marksman, known among Marines only by the nickname the Cobra, killed a gunnery sergeant near Hathcock's own quarters. Hathcock tracked him for days through terrain both men knew intimately, a duel where the entire outcome hinged, again, on which sniper broke the one-shot rule first and gave away his position doing it. Hathcock's Vietnam service ended not in a duel, but in a fire. In September 1969, riding an armored vehicle that struck a mine near the village of Quezon, he was engulfed in burning fuel and, despite his own injuries, pulled 7 Marines clear of the wreckage before the flames could reach them. He would spend the following decade training the next generation of Marine snipers at Quantico, passing along the same discipline that had kept him alive through 2 tours. Whatever the range, whatever the target, the rifle in your hands had exactly one job, and it was not to give you a second chance to get it right. The Rule Land, Hathcock, Mawhinney, and every Marine sniper school in Vietnam built their doctrine around was never really about marksmanship in the purely technical sense. Plenty of Marines could shoot a tight group on a known distance range. What separated a sniper from a marksman was the willingness to accept that in combat, unlike competition, there was no second target presentation, no do-over, no adjustment for a called shot. There was only the first round, fired from a position that would very likely be compromised the moment the muzzle blast reached anyone listening. And the discipline to make sure that single round did everything it needed to do before that happened. Confirmed kills, the number most often repeated when Hathcock's or Mawhinney's names come up, were themselves a byproduct of that same discipline rather than the point of it. A kill counted as confirmed only when independently verified, typically by a second observer beyond the sniper's own spotter, which meant the true number of enemy soldiers removed from the battlefield by Marine snipers in Vietnam almost certainly exceeded the official tallies by a wide margin. Neither Hathcock nor Mawhinney treated the count as the measure of the job done well. The measure was simpler and less quotable. How many missions ended with the team walking out on their own terms, undetected, because the first shot had done exactly what it needed to do. The M40 rifle itself would go on to serve in successive updated variants for the next half-century of Marine Corps history, carried by scout snipers from Vietnam's jungles through deserts and mountains that land Remington's custom shop, and the young Marines who first carried it into triple canopy could never have specifically pictured. What never changed across 5 decades of updates to the rifle was the doctrine that came with it. First written not in a manual, but in the unwritten rule, a handful of Marines carried into Vietnam's jungles and passed down to everyone who came after them. Miss once, and the war finds you first.